Hi, welcome to this episode of Authors Love Readers podcast, where we delve into the stories behind the stories. We ask authors questions, some of them fun, some of them serious, and from their answers, you're going to learn things you never knew about the people who write the stories you love. My name is Patricia Mclinn. I'm your host and designated question asker.
I'm Matty Dalrymple, and I am an author who loves readers.
I'm also here to ask you to help support Authors Love Readers podcast. You can do that in a number of ways. Of course, we would appreciate very much your joining us on Patreon, where you can pay as little as $1 a month to show your support for the podcast and to help keep it going. As a one-time deal, you can also do something called Buy Me a Coffee. There's a link to that on my Facebook page. That's Patricia Mclinn's Facebook page. And there will also be a link on the Authors Love Readers website and Facebook page. In addition, we love to have you subscribe and to like the podcast, and comments. Comments are always welcome, and especially spreading the word to your fellow listeners, readers, maybe aspiring writers, anybody who you think would enjoy these conversations. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that support. Now, let's start the show. Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Authors Love Readers podcast. My guest on this episode is Matty Dalrymple. And Matty, I have to tell you, my listeners are used to me saying that I know somebody from Novelist Inc. This time, not so. See, I'm not so predictable, all you listeners. I know Matty from the podcasting world just a little bit. I mean, I listened to her. We haven't conversed before. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And
yeah, likewise.
Hear about your writing, Matty. So tell us a little bit about that first.
Well, I am the author of the Kinnear Suspense novels and Suspense shorts and the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. And as you mentioned, I also podcast, write, speak, and consult on independent publishing and the writing craft as the indie author.
So did you start in indie, or had you been traditionally published?
I started right out with indie. I published my first book in 2013, and as I was wrapping up the book and thinking about how I wanted to get it out into the world, I started asking the traditionally published authors I knew what their experience was, and I wasn't overwhelmed with enthusiasm for what I was hearing, let's say. And I wasn't thinking in quite these organized terms, but what I've boiled it down to for myself is that if you go the traditional route, you get a certain amount of access. In other words, I could probably get my book into a Barnes & Noble if I spent a lot of time on it, but it was going to be much more of a challenge for me than it would be for traditionally published authors. And I would probably only have a chance of doing that in my local Barnes & Nobles, which were looking to support me as a local author, and bragging rights. So I'm never going to get the same, like, ooh, how exciting, by telling someone that I'm published by William Kingsfield Publishers, which is my imprint, as I will if I were to mention one of the big five or the big four, however many big ones there are now.
Fewer and fewer.
Fewer and fewer, although I guess they're adding Amazon now, so maybe we're back up to 5.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that attracted me about indie is creativity, i.e. I can be creative on my own schedule. Control, I'm never going to get a cover that I hate. Care, by which I mean I'm not limited to this burst of attention during the time a book is launching. I can care for my books forever, and I'm still focusing my advertising and promotion work on my first book from 2013. And cash. I actually said those first 3 to someone on a podcast, and they said, and cash, because you do make more money per book in royalties as an indie author than you do as a traditionally published author. So
yes, you do.
I know that you're coming from the experience of having had both those experiences.
Yeah. Yes. And you're not going to get me started talking about that. We're going to talk about you, Matty.
That would be a whole separate episode.
So why suspense? What grabs you about that as a writer and a reader?
Well, I do enjoy reading those kinds of books. And I know many, many authors, when they're asked, talk about how they were writing since they could hold a pencil and, went way, way back. And I did a certain amount of writing. I took creative writing classes in college. And my father was an author. My father wrote short stories primarily under William Kingsfield, which is where I got the name of my imprint from.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, he had short stories back in the 50s and Cosmopolitan and Collier's. I mean, some big names in the short fiction publishing world at the time. And then, he was getting a certain amount of success there. And then he thought, well, I'm going to turn my attention to novels. And not only do I think that his skill set was really based in short fiction more so than novel length works, but there was no option for indie publishing then. And so you were in the queue, you were in the slush pile with all those other hundreds or dozens or thousands of aspiring authors. So that never panned out for him. But I did a certain amount of writing, and becoming a writer was always a goal of mine because it had been a goal of my father's. But I think my training was mainly in being a voracious reader. And I enjoyed those kinds of books. And the way that I really launched into that genre, it was not planned. I just had a scene in my mind. I had a scene that would play out in my mind. And this has happened for almost all my books, that for years, I had the scene playing out in my mind. And it's the kind of thing I would sort of ponder as I was falling asleep at night. And it was about a woman who can sense spirits. And she has a business around that run by her brother. And at the time, I was spending a lot of time in San Francisco because my sister lived out there. And I pictured that she has a job. Somebody hires her to go to one of those beautiful old Victorian homes in San Francisco. And she arrives and she does not know, but the reader knows that a murder took place there. And she has such a visceral reaction to being at the house that she can't even go in. She can't even discharge the engagement she's been hired to do. I thought it was going to be the central scene of a novel. In fact, it was just one of several sort of blips in the storyline. But then I had to think of everything I wanted to do to write up to that moment, and everything I wanted to do to write to the end of the story to make it a satisfying experience for the reader. So I think Suspense kind of picked me.
So in subsequent books, that sounds like that scene ended up being not the first one in the
Correct
book. How about subsequent books? Do you tend to have a scene? Are you starting at the beginning and writing all the way through? I'll tell you, I don't. So
I was just listening to your interview with Joanna Penn about plotting and pantsing and outlining and all that good stuff. And I have some thoughts on that because I just had an article in Writer's Digest called Creating Your Story Frame. And we can talk about that if you want to. But almost all the stories have been inspired by this one scene that I see very clearly in my mind. And in The Sense of Death, which is the book that I'm talking about, an early scene is actually the murder. It's suspense. It's not mystery. The question is not who done it, because the reader knows who done it. The question is going to be, is the protagonist going to survive her interactions that she has with this person who committed murder? And really, the subsequent books became much more mystery focused. So my more recent books in that series, the Ann Kinnear series, are actually whodunit kind of mysteries. But I almost always have the scene that inspires me, and then I really have to step back from that. And I wrote this article for Writer's Digest called Creating Your Story Frame, based on the very painful experience I had with my fifth Ann Kinnear book, which is called A Serpent's Tooth, which was supposed to launch in October of 2021. And earlier that year, I sent it to the editor, and he sent it back, and there was much that he liked about it, but he was unconvinced at the motivation of one of the major characters, which is a pretty big problem if you're writing a mystery. Yeah. And so, October became November, and November became December, and on and on. And I was having to just tear out and redo. It was like, to use the boating analogy that I love to use for the writing craft and the publishing voyage, it was like having built a canoe and then realize what you really need is a tugboat. And you just have to rip and tear. If you want your reader to have a good experience, you have to rip and tear. And I probably threw out more words from my fifth Ann Kinnear book than I had in any other book. And so I have become, with book 6, I became much more diligent about making sure my frame was in place. And I don't like to use the word outline because that sounds very restrictive, but my frame was well established before I started putting on all the, let's call it, bright work of the descriptions and the fun dialogue and all those other things. So Yeah, that's kind of a long answer to your question about that scene is the inspiration.
But that's interesting. I still just dive in and take my chances. And then I've probably told this story before. I had a mystery where I thought I was doing really well. I was a little ahead of schedule, which just doesn't happen for me. I'm like, I come right skidding up to deadline. And I thought I was doing really well. Boom. The person I thought was the murderer ended up dead. And I'm typing this and going, no, wait, wait. So I, that sudden where you're stopped. So let's ask you some questions to let the readers get to know you a little bit. Did you have any really interesting jobs before you became a writer, or what would you be doing if you weren't a writer? And/or you can answer both.
Well, this isn't terrifically interesting, but I worked in a Hickory Farms when I was in high school. Does anybody even know what Hickory Farms is anymore? So it's like the cheese store. Yeah. So I wore like the little denim dress, and I gave people slices of cheese. I don't think I was there very long.
Not your future, huh?
It was not my future. You know, my future ended up being, I graduated. So I went to Dickinson College. I majored in English Lit. And then I spent one semester at the graduate English program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and quickly realized that that was not for me. I think I was one of only two sort of token small liberal arts college students, and all the other students had Ivy League undergrad degrees. And it was clear that although my undergraduate education was very good, it was not geared toward graduate studies in English Lit. And so I would go to classes and the instructor would say, like, well, since obviously all of you have already read the Iliad and the Odyssey, we're just going to like move right on to book 3, assuming you already have all that information. So I was trying to read the Iliad and the Odyssey, you know, like over that weekend. And it just wasn't fun.
Yeah.
So eventually I became a project manager. So I was a project manager in the IT world for many years before I left in 2019.
Well, that's an interesting segue though. How did you convince the first person to hire you as a project manager?
It was really just something. I got my first job largely because of my writing skill, but not fiction writing skills. So it was early on, it was painting manuals for salespeople for a computer system, a company that sold medical computer systems. And then I just sort of moved around in that company a lot until I landed in the IT department as a project manager, and eventually ended up at QVC. Interesting. As a project manager for many, many years. I supported the IT group there and the logistics group, the warehouse group. So I got lots of insights into what went on there.
Have you been tempted to write a suspense or a murder mystery with that background, QVC?
There are a couple of very funny, I don't know if this is a mystery or not, but what is Augustine Burroughs wrote Celevision, I think, which was a very funny take on a home shopping network. And everybody thought that he had based it on QVC. This was years ago. And everybody thought they knew who each of the characters was, like the real people in real life. I kind of feel like that's been done. And also I would feel creepy about writing a murder mystery about people who are sure to say, oh my goodness, they just killed me off. You know, Matty Dalrymple just killed me off. I can't believe that.
I will tell you, I don't think people recognize themselves.
Really?
When I first started writing, I was doing romances, and the traditional publishers would say, oh, you should set something at the Washington Post. I'm going, not romantic, not romantic at all. But when I started writing murder mysteries, oh yes, I could kill off some former coworkers. And
it's a great secret way to get back at the people that have wronged you, is to kill them off in your books.
Therapy too. It's so satisfying. But nobody recognizes themselves. They think they know who other people are, but I've yet to have anybody recognize. And they, you know, they can start from a seed of somebody else, but then the character becomes themselves. So that may be why the real people don't recognize what sparked my thought that then became that character. So in fairness.
It's very interesting. I mean, I know authors who have very explicitly portrayed a person in real life, and and they didn't recognize themselves as you're describing. I've also had the experience of people thinking that it's them when it's really not. Like in my case, everyone's going to laugh at this, but my husband is named Wade and he is a pilot. And in my first Dan Kinnear book, there's his name is Wade Walton. And in the first Dan Kinnear book, there's a character named Walt Fetterman, who's a pilot. And coincidentally, he flies the same airplane as my husband because that's the plane I can describe the best.
Sure.
And everyone says, well, of course, Walt Fetterman is really Wade Walt. And I'm like, no, not really. I honestly didn't have that in mind when I was writing that character. I was only borrowing like the make and model of the plane so that I could describe it accurately.
Yeah. Yeah. I had the same experience. I set a series at Northwestern, which is where I went to school. And I had friends saying, oh, I know what sparked that, and I remember this, and I'm going, I made that up. I totally made that up. Nobody ever did that I knew of, anyhow.
But you made it up so convincingly that they now think that it really happened.
I think they wanted to remember it. So let's. What's your favorite color?
Blue.
Why? Do you have a reason? Is there an association?
I like the sky sea kind of connection. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes
sea,
Yeah. So where did you draw the love of the sea?
Well, I think it's really love of boats.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because I do, I'd mentioned before that I like to use nautical metaphors for the writing craft and the publishing voyage. And for people who are just listening, I have a picture of the boat on my wall. And I just have a fascination with boats. From the writing point of view, there's really nothing that can happen to an author that can't be accurately reflected in a comparison to something about boats.
Thinking, right?
Yeah, well, there's the whole, I wrote a book called Taking the Short Tack with Mark Lefebvre about how you can use short fiction. And I wanted it to be very much, I wanted to continue the nautical analogy. And so I went to a friend of mine who's a sailor and I said, I need to title this something that's, it's about short fiction. So I want to have the word short in it. So he introduced me to the term short tack, which is where if you're trying to maneuver in a limited space, you might take a short tack, or it's just, you're more maneuverable. And, if you would take a long tack, you would sail into the ground, and so there was lots of things I could do with that. I think being on the water is very attractive to me. Like it's either very soothing or very exciting, depending on the circumstances.
Was that from childhood? Was that
not so much? I've gone through a couple of phases in my life where I had an opportunity to spend quite a lot of time as an adult on sailboats, and then a different period of my life where I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time on motorboats. And I think both, the environment is just so pleasant, but I think if I were coming back and having a second career, I would become a boat interior designer, and I see all sorts of analogies as we're saying this about my author life. I'm fascinated with how they fit so much into such a small space. And I'm very much like that as a writer, that if I have, like, if I write my frame and I've sort of filled out the story, but now I'm, tweaking the details, I'm getting a little more into the nuts and bolts, the ribs and the planks, then I'll often look for opportunities where I can use one character to do two things, because I just like that effect of having the story be very tight and sort of insular and claustrophobic in a way. I think that that's very useful for creating suspense. And so I might have, somebody who was the bartender, and then later on, the person who sees the crime. And I think, oh, I can have the bartender see the crime. And it tightens things up. It's kind of making the most efficient use of space. So, I think that's where there's a writing tie-in for me.
You know what else that's great for is economy of names, because I find naming characters, I feel like I've used all the names.
Yeah.
plus books, and then it's like, oh, I think I named somebody that, and sometimes I forget. So that's really smart, Matty. I'm going to have to pay more attention to see who I can combine, so I can only use one name.
Well, the other a tip or offer I'll throw out to your listeners is that I have a private group on Facebook called Matty Dalrymple Readers Group, and they have proven to be the mother lode of character names, because a lot of times I'll say, you know, I need the first name only of a teenage boy who is staffing a checkout at Target. And I'll just get a boatload of responses, and I'll pick one. And then that person is super excited.
That's really cool. But then don't you also need to say it can't start with such and such a letter, or it needs to start with such and such a letter? Because I try to avoid using the same first letter for a lot of names.
Ideally, I get enough so that if there are parameters like that, I can kind of
work around,
sort through them. Yeah, but that's a fun way to do it. And I also remember hearing about your trick that you have kind of a central source where you can quickly search across all your books to say Henry. I think Henry was the name that you tend to like gravitate
Henry
toward.
shows up all the time. but I also realize I have named a secondary character in Cotton, Wyoming, Claire, and then I have Claire who's the sidekick in the Secret Sleuth series. And of course I didn't realize it in time to change it. So books were out with each of them. Sorry, guys. They're not the same person, I swear.
Well, I had in my first book, The Sense of Death, I read it, my editor read it, beta readers read it, readers read it. And it was like at least a year after it was out, where I read a review that said, you know, they generally really liked it, but I wish that there hadn't been two characters, one of whom was named Scott and one of whom was named Scotty. And I was like, oh my God, I not only didn't realize that, but nobody else that read it before it got published realized that I had named two characters, Scott and Scotty. Fortunately, one of them was a woman. So normally, based on the context, it was clear that Scotty was a woman. But I think it's really easy to gravitate to certain names and want to use them all over the place.
You hear them, you know, they just come into your head, and that's it. It's I tend not to name my characters right away either. It's like I've got to know them better so they can spend some time in the book, in the process of the book, as the woman in the convertible, you know, or however I'm thinking of it, and they can become a hugely important character, and yet this is how I started with them. So
I think it's I kind of struggle with that, because to avoid having to put the woman in the convertible over and over again, I generally at some point say, okay, this is going to be a character I'm going to reference a lot. I need to give them a name, and I can always change it later. But 90% of the time, once I name them, that's the name it's going to be.
I can't do that. The name sets something about them. And it can change them in ways. Okay, we got right into the books and the writing. Let's go back and let readers get to know you a little bit more. Did you have like a childhood book that really got you interested in story? Did you gravitate to story because of your dad, or did you rebel against it because of your dad?
Oh, I definitely gravitated to it. And, you know, my parents were, all my family members were big readers, and they encouraged reading. And I remember my dad over and over reading Treasure Island to me. That was an early favorite. But I would say a book that really stands out for me is The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White. And then more generally, the Once and Future King set of books. And what I think is really interesting about that, like some of my favorite lines, like I still quote, my sister and I especially still quote lines from The Sword and the Stone. And I thought what was really interesting is that was my favorite book as a child. And then as I got a little older, I ventured into some of the other books, like The Queen of Air and Darkness. I'm not going to be able to come up with the names, but there is a shocking change between The Sword and the Stone and the next book, which is clearly written for adults. Like it starts right out with a bang. Like this is not kid stuff anymore. And I thought if one person can do that, like write these in many cases, very funny scenes, you know, touching scenes, poignant scenes, harrowing scenes for children, and then transition to doing the very same thing for adults, but in a totally different tone. I just found that fascinating.
That's a great skill. That's a wonderful skill. I can remember coming downstairs to the kitchen and reading things out loud from The Once and Future King to my mom. Saying, listen to this, listen to this. She's going, because I was known to do that now and then. I didn't read that whole series. I don't think I knew it was a series, actually.
Yeah, I don't know. I should go back and look and see how it came about. Like, did he write the ones that are more adult focused first and go back to Sword and Stone? Did he write them all in order? I'm just not sure. But you know, obviously, spoiler alert: The Sword and the Stone ends with King Arthur discovering that he's King Arthur, and then after that, it's all the machinations and all the things that happen in King Arthur's court.
Yeah,
which is much more, not exactly Game of Thrones-esque, but like the early version of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, not quite as the body count is lower.
Yeah, exactly.
For my listeners, yes, that is Tessa acting up. So, do you have a motivational or upbeat quote that means a lot to you, that you say a lot, or that gets you, or something from your parents that they said?
Yeah. So I'm going to be embarrassed. As soon as we're done talking, I'm going to think of a really fabulous inspirational quote that I wish I would have thought of, but I
email it to me and I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, everybody check the show notes because it's going to be better than what I'm about to say. But I have to say that the thing that pops out of my mouth a lot is slow and steady wins the race.
Yes.
And that is true of my writing business. It's true of my writing. I just think that, you know, coming to it every day, not expecting miraculous things to occur, putting the work in and understanding what your goals are and understanding it will take you some time to get there. And then I also, thinking of how this might apply for readers, on my podcast, The Author, I interview a lot of authors, and many of them are now saying that they're writing shorter and shorter books because the ROI on a short book is you get them out faster, you can charge the same amount of money. It's like a more profitable thing. And so rapid release was a big thing for a while. Or all these authors who were, well, theoretically, all these authors who were putting out a book a month. And I was skeptical. And I said, but I didn't want to discount it without researching it, you know. So I asked people in my genre, I was specifically interested in thrillers. I said, what's the name of a thriller author that you think the quality of the books is good and they're rapid releasing? And I should tell you the name, but I'm not positive I remember it right. So I don't want to say the name, but I probably wouldn't want to say it anyway for other reasons, but I got the books and they were well written, but I realized that the reason that this author could write as fast as he or she was writing is that they really didn't have much color commentary. You know, there would be a scene where it would be, and then the main character went into the bar, sat down on a bar stool and talked with the other person. I was like, no, I want to know, is it like a biker bar? It is like a she gentrified? Is it ferns?
Yeah.
You know, is it like an Irish pub? And if what you're looking for is plot, then that's fine. You know, a bar is a bar, who cares? But that's not how I like to read. I like the slow and steady reading experience as well as the slow and steady writing experience.
So for your slow and steady reading experience, I mean, I was going to use an example, and then I was going to say Dickens, where, you know, there's great
that might be too slow,
tactile descriptions and but so there's kind of three things: there's descriptions, there's characters, and there's plot. And I know I like the characters. I always think of, I read a book where it started off with they were running for their lives, and I thought, you know, intellectually that's a really good opening, but as a reader I thought, who cares? I don't know who these people are. I know the people first. So I am very strongly that I want that slower reading experience, to know the characters, to experience the story through the characters. So are you looking for both the world building and the characters, or one more than the other as a reader and as a writer?
Yeah, I do really enjoy very fully fleshed out worlds as a reader, especially if it's fantasy or science fiction or something like that.
Oh.
You know, I enjoy those details. And I like to understand the characters for exactly the reason you're saying. I can't really enjoy the story if I don't care about the characters in them. And I like when the personalities of the characters are illustrated through the actions they take and the thoughts they have, not explicitly told to the reader, like, Jane was a good person because she always contributed at the office. You know, I want to see Jane contributing at the office, but then sort of feeling bad that she was forced into that or something like that. So I love getting to know the characters. And one of my most fun interactions with readers is when I go to book clubs who have read my book, and they talk about the characters like they were real people.
Yes.
Like, I think Anne should date Joe. Are you kidding? I think she should date this other person. There's always a lot of conversation.
What do you mean,
about who
like
Anne
they're
should be
real
dating.
people? They are real people.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's one of those fun things that having interactions with readers, like, you just can't beat when you can talk about these people and they're your friends.
Yes.
Yeah.
And nobody thinks you're crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
I have done a workshop also where I talk about that description is characterization, and it's emotional characterization, because what is described through that character's point of view, and who they are and what they're going through at that moment is going to determine what they see in that scene. So your person walking into a bar who is has had a really rough day, and boy, they're going to have a scotch because, you know, things have gone wrong all day, is going to see and focus on different things from somebody who is ducking into that bar because they're being chased.
Yeah.
I really like to focus on the description from the character and bring that character, because you bring not only the reader into the scene, you bring the reader into the character in that scene, in that surroundings. Sorry, guys, readers, we got technical on the writing stuff.
Well, I think it's things that really pop out at readers, even if they're not thinking of it in sort of academic terms. But my editor, John McGoran, who's also an author himself, is a maniac about point of view. And he has trained me to make sure, very similar to what you were saying about going into the bar, there's also the difference between the person who is going into the bar because they've had a rough day and they're going to go get a scotch, and this is their first visit to the bar, versus it's that's where they go after work every day. So if it's their first visit to the bar, it makes sense that they would say, you know, the dusty bottles that were lined up along the in front of the mirror behind the bar, and the cracked bar stool seats. But it kind of doesn't make sense if they go there every day, because they wouldn't be noticing that stuff anymore. And I think those kinds of things, even if a reader isn't conscious of, like, the moment at which a point of view rule has been violated, it still kind of takes you out of it. Like, why would he be noticing that?
Yeah, it doesn't ring true.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, because you want that emotional resonance, and a character who's noticing those things, who's been there all the time, just doesn't resonate right.
Right.
So,
right.
Okay. I have another question that I love to ask people. I have this weird deserted island because you can't get off of it, but you can play movies, but only 3 movies.
Oh.
I don't know why their technology only allows 3, but it only allows 3 movies. So you get 3 movies you're going to watch over and over and over as long as you're on this deserted island.
Okay.
And you get to pick. Isn't this a weird deserted island?
Picking is key.
Pick which 3 movies.
Am I? Okay. The Princess Bride.
Oh, that's
there's like not even a question about that. One of them would be The Princess Bride. Oh man, and 2 others. All of mine are going to be so old. I haven't actually been to a movie theater. People are going to think I'm going to say since before COVID, but honestly, it's been since before I was married, and I've been married 16 years. So I haven't been to a movie for a really long time, but I'm trying to think of a movie that I both love and that holds up really well over time, so that it would stand up to repeated viewings. Well, I think that one might be the first Rocky movie. Oh. I just think that that's a beautifully created and realized movie. And I had a huge crush on Sylvester Stallone when I was young. And, another one that I might put on the list is The Wizard of Oz. Mainly because if I ever got off the desert island and returned to my podcasting gig, many, many authors and instructors of authors use The Wizard of Oz as an instruction. Like you can illustrate a lot of things really well using The Wizard of Oz. Yeah. So like the story arc, the idea of motivation and what is Dorothy wanting at different points in the story. The hero's journey, exactly. So this is another one. You'll have to have lots of notes because it's like with the quote that I could only come up with a boring quote. I'm going to come up with like the 2 other movies that I really should have said. Spinal Tap. I don't know. Maybe I'll kick one of them out for Spinal Tap.
The Wizard of Oz is kind of old, but I tend to go back to Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn movies. So
yeah.
His Girl Friday is one of my very favorite movies.
Oh yeah.
So you want to talk about old, Matty? we're really talking old. So I have a tendency to ask a lot of questions, and sometimes I forget or get jammed at the end. So I want to make sure we ask the questions that came from readers first. And because of how we've been talking about this, let's talk first with, this was from a reader who asks, where do your stories come from? And she says, I know one author who dreams her stories. Another has a character suddenly taking up residence in her head. And I always love this. So how are your beautiful stories born?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying before about having that one scene that plays out very vividly in my mind. And I don't know, I can't figure out where that came from. But it is one of those things where a lot of these have been sort of percolating along for years. Like I have one of these scenes that plays out in my mind, and it's not, so I have 2 series. I have the Kinnear suspense novels and I have the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers. And the common theme is what happens when an extraordinary ability transforms an ordinary life. So I already mentioned Anne's extraordinary ability is that she can sense spirits, and Lizzy Ballard has a different extraordinary ability that I can't really say because it would be a spoiler. Okay. But I have this scene playing out in my mind that's very vivid to me, but it doesn't really fit into either of those new scenarios. But so here's one that is kind of an interesting one. That is about the book that I'm writing now. So, and this was, again, one of these things that I would think about before I would go to bed. And it was about a woman who lived in my grandmother's old apartment building, except it had been transported to New York City. And a woman lives there, and originally it was set around 9/11, and she experiences 9/11. She goes back to her apartment, and then she finds she can't leave. She's developed agoraphobia. And so, and I knew I didn't want to write about 9/11 because people who actually experienced it have dibs on that. I didn't want to venture into that. But I thought, any kind of traumatic experience that a person has that causes them to not be able to leave their home in a busy apartment building. And so her son, daughter, some child is trying to figure out ways to get the woman out of the apartment so that she can live a more normal life. And this was stretched over months and months, which wasn't realistic for a novel. So, in any case, it would have had to have been shortened up. And so the child gives this woman a sedative to hopefully knock her out sufficiently so she can make the trip out of wherever she is, New York City in this case, and go to a more calm place where hopefully she can be more comfortable. And the woman overdoses. And so her daughter, I think it was a daughter, shows up at her apartment to pick her up to take her away, and she's dead. And then what happens? And so that, in a vastly changed scenario, is the basis for the book I'm writing now. And there are aspects that I had to give up, that I regretted having to give up, but I couldn't make a story that stretched over months. There was just no way that was going to continue to be interesting. But I married that idea up with the fact that I have friends who have a condo in Ocean City, Maryland. I needed to get a way to finish up my 5th book. And they made their condo available to me. And it was in like November or something like that. And a big condo building in Ocean City, Maryland in November is a pretty creepy place to be, as there's nobody there. It's like there are, you know, probably hundreds of units in this building. And I'll bet there were moments when I was the only person in the building. And so it was just intrinsically super creepy. So I thought, you know what? She doesn't live in an apartment building. She lives in a condo building in Ocean City, Maryland. So, you know, then you find those ways of saying, oh, here's a cool idea and here's a cool idea. And I'm going to marry them together and hopefully, you know.
Yeah. So kind of coming back to the reader's question of where your stories come from, it sounds sort of like Magpie, you know, that you pick up pieces here and there. Very much how I do it. And I'm often surprised by the juxtaposition that arises, but so okay, let's go off the condo in Ocean City. Another reader asks, what is your favorite place to write and why? And she asks if it has an inspirational view, which I think she's hoping for an inspirational view for us.
Well, I'm very fortunate that the home where my husband and I live has a beautiful screened-in porch. The rest of the house is lovely too. It was actually built by a guy who was a woodworker, and he and his wife really liked colonial Williamsburg. And he decorated our first floor all in colonial Williamsburg style. Like the living room has this beautiful, beautiful wood paneling and molding that is like 16 different pieces of wood. It's really lovely. But the screened-in porch was the key. And, you know, we have enough land around us that I can sit on the screened-in porch or at my desk that looks over past the screened-in porch into the backyard to have that nice kind of calm effect. And then the places we go, going back to the importance of the water, we do love going to Mount Desert Island, Maine, and we always stay in the water. And so I have two favorite porches, or maybe three favorite porches, our porch and two of the porches of the houses we stay in there. So yeah, those are my inspirational places.
What general area do you live?
I live outside Philadelphia.
Okay. I lived outside Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia for a long time. And I had a little post-World War II colonial with a screened-in porch that I just loved. And I so miss it. I still miss it here. I'm still trying to figure out where I can add a porch here without making the house really dark. And me broke, but it's more the darkness. Well, that's a wonderful place to write. And I think you do have an inspirational view. So I'm going to combine these two other readers' questions because they ask about when a cover doesn't match the character description. And that reader says that's a pet peeve. How does it feel? And another one says, how much does it bother you to find editing errors after your book goes live or is printed?
So the answer to the first question about the cover is I generally, if I show a cover, will anyone see it, or should I just describe it?
We describe it, but we can put it in the show notes too.
So of the two series, the Anne Kinnear novels do not have any people on the cover. They're just an object. It's a central object. In one case, it's an antique brass door knocker in the shape of a hand. And another one, it's a broken aviation instrument because it was about aviation theme, and one, it's a padlock. So no people there. The Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, the first cover that I got done, and I'm publishing myself, so I get to choose the covers. They're never going to be ones I hate. I actually got the cover by running a contest on a site called 99 Designs. And so you put the spec out there, and then lots of people respond to it. And it was interesting because unlike the Anne Kinnear novels, with the Lizzy Ballard novels, I had no idea what I wanted the covers to look like. And so the person that I chose to do the cover had this very stylized view of a woman from the back. So I told him that the protagonist is a teenage girl with long blonde hair. And this was a teenage girl with long blonde hair, but from the back. And if you just glanced at it, you almost couldn't tell that it was a person. I think it was on the book designer site. They had you could submit your covers and they would comment on them. And the comment was, is this a girl from the back, or is it a tunnel leading into the story? Because you just saw like the outline of the girl in her. So then we came out to the second book in the trilogy, and the cover that he sent me, and again, I just told him in general what I was looking for, had a profile of a woman. And I was a little bit on the fence, but again, it's very, if people look up the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers, it's not a very literal depiction. It's just kind of part of the design. So you can see, a profile view of the woman. And then in the third book, I said, okay, well, we have the character from the back. We have the character from the side. I think we probably need a front view, but again, very subtly done, so that I don't think anyone would look at that and say, oh, that's not how I pictured her. Because that is a pet peeve of mine. Like, I don't like it when authors say, yeah, I had so-and-so in mind when I did this character, because I'm like, like, that's not how I pictured them. I don't want to hear what you pictured.
Right.
What I pictured.
Get out of my way. It's me in the book.
Yeah. So, and I will also just say that first cover that I described for the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers is quite different now. So if people go up and look at the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers and see the covers, I realized that although that original image I got of the woman from the back was very attractive and subtle, it was too subtle for online platforms, and it kind of got lost.
Yeah.
And so he redid it to be much more movement-ish, but it's still a woman from the back. So yeah, I think the fact that I toned down the literalness of it helps. But I just had somebody do a book trailer for me, and it was for one of the Lizzy Ballard books, and he put a snippet of video in there with a woman in it, where she's walking away from the camera, and then she turns and you see her profile for a few seconds. And at first I was like, oh, no, I don't want that. And then I was like, he actually did a really good job of finding a video snippet of a woman who looks a lot like I imagine the character to look. So I kind of went with it. But I do know what that reader means, that sometimes if you put too much very literally on the cover, it does kind of take away some of the fun of making up the person yourself.
Or if you contradict, I think, too, what they're saying. But I always thought it would be an interesting blog, and someday I'm going to get this organized, guys, honest, to show the history of the covers for books.
Yes.
And especially because some of mine started traditionally published. And when I first was indie, and I started in 2010, I did everything myself, including the covers. First money that came in, I applied to having other people do covers, because that's
it is a skill.
My strongest point, to show the progression and well, I should get off on that.
Well, anything having to do with book covers, I'm fascinated by. And even if you take a book like Catch-22, it's fascinating to look at what the traditionally published covers for Catch-22 have been over time, and how reflective they were of the times that at the time it was published. And I also think what's fascinating, and I think your readers will appreciate this, is the tropes that come and go in book covers. So and if anyone subscribes to something like BookBub, then you probably see this, that you get your BookBub daily email, and it has like 6 or 7 books that, BookBub is recommending for whatever genre you pick. And so I was signed up for thriller, mystery, suspense. And I swear that like every other email had a woman in a yellow jacket running away into the distance. And I was like, how many people in yellow jackets can there be? But it was very clear, very intentionally chosen. And to say, if you like this other book.
For those of you who don't see the visual, Matty is wearing a gold jacket or sweater. Don't run away, Matty. Don't run away.
But yeah, it was very intentionally intended to send that message that if you like this other book with a woman in the yellow jacket running away, you're going to like this one too. And then I think it's interesting that trope is going to go away. That convention is going to go away. And all those books are going to need to be recovered, because it's going to be some other message that you want to be sending.
I'm such a contrarian, though, as a reader, as a consumer, that really bugs me that
Yeah.
the covers all look alike, and
Yeah.
I get tired of it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So,
You risk turning people off as well as attracting people.
yes. And I also, as traditionally published, I had covers that had characters like I have one where he is a lawyer and a rancher. She's a rancher, and it has this couple on the cover, and he's in a suit and she's in a dress. It is at their wedding, but it's so untypical of who they are and so unreflective of who they are. Not to mention that the guy really looks like David Schwimmer. And I'm like, what? And there's another one where the guy is supposed to be, he is a rodeo, he's a bull rider, and they tend to be kind of whip thin and strong, but thinner. And this guy's like a sumo wrestler. I have no idea where it came from. So I went to object covers when I had control. So I don't have people at my covers. So I will never irk you, reader, who wrote that question, because they can't not match the character description. And here's another question.
Oh, so you had asked about the typos. How do you feel when you get a typo?
Yes.
So I would say, and I'm guessing that you're going to agree, that this is one of the joys of being indie. And the example I will use is at the end of my second Anne Kinnear book. Anne is in Mount Desert Island, Maine, because I love to write about Maine. And her brother comes up from Philadelphia, and I had a part where he rents a car, and the logistics are kind of complicated, but somebody wrote a review saying that they liked the book, but he said, I couldn't understand why the brother had to rent a car when he had just driven up. And I was like, no, but you know what? I could fix that in like 15 minutes, because all I have to do is take out the he rented a car sentence and say he used his own car to go where he needed to go. And you don't have to worry about, thousands of books sitting in a warehouse that say that he rented a car, because you don't have to print thousands of copies. They get printed as people buy them. And
a 2-year process to get that, if they would ever correct it at all on future copies, which they wouldn't always. So yes, it does drive me crazy. And at the same time, I recognize from my journalism background and being an editor, your mind sees what you expect to see. And so it is extremely difficult. I'm a really good editor. I spot a lot of typos, but it's harder to see it in your own work because you know what it's supposed to say.
Exactly.
And there it is. And I'm going back through something right now. I'm reworking and changing. And darn if there aren't some goofs in there. And it drives me crazy. So I always say to readers, if you see one, because as you said, Matty, we can correct them. Let us know, please email us. Preferably email us rather than in a review, because then your review the reader's review doesn't hold water, because it's been changed later. So give us a shot at changing it, and that's great.
That is great advice. Thank you for putting that out there. So
on this last question from a reader, I think is brilliant and mean. If you could write a book with any author, alive or dead, who would you want to work with and why?
J.K. Rowling on the Cormoran Strike books.
Oh, interesting. Why?
Yeah. Well, I love the Harry Potter books. And I love reading those kind of books, but I'm never going to write that kind of sort of fantasy book myself. But I love the Cormoran Strike books. And I think she is just brilliant at characterization. And I'm always impressed by the fact that the people that you're rooting for can be so flawed, and the people that you're supposed to be rooting against can nonetheless be so compelling. She never falls into this kind of black and white character presentation. But I especially admire her Cormoran Strike books, which she writes under the name Robert Galbraith. And so, yes, if I was teaming up with an author, it would be her based on the way I actually write. If I could write any way I wanted to, then I would pair up with Neil Gaiman, because I just love his books, and I wish I could write. Neverwhere is one of my favorite books, and if I could write that kind of book, if I could stand at Neil Gaiman's side and write the sequel to Neverwhere, which I think has never come out yet, then that would be my other wish.
Why do you think you can't write like that?
I don't think I have the patience to think through that kind of world building, that kind of fantastical world building. I love thinking through the details of the worlds I'm building that are quite, largely based on the world I live in. Like the book that just came out, A Serpent's Tooth, is based in a winery, and it's actually kind of based in a winery that's near me. And so I got to spend a lot of time at a winery. I love being a writer. And while I love reading those stories about people who kind of out of whole cloth make a completely new world, it's not where my strength is, but it would be super fun if it was.
So I'm thinking that it's sort of the difference or elements of observers of the real world, and I would fall into that category as well, versus I almost hate to say it, but it's creative.
Yeah.
Of imagination.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way of dividing it. I think that's really accurate.
Yeah. Have you, I will say I'll be talking to somebody and say, oh, did you see this and this and this? And did you notice that? And they go, no. And after I started writing books, my sister-in-law, who I've known since, she babysat for me when I was in first grade, because my brother's significantly older, said, for the first time, I understand why when we would take walks and you would point things out, you were gathering all these details.
Yeah.
I was like, doesn't everybody? I had no idea.
Yeah, that's an excellent. I've never heard anybody describe it quite that way, but I think that is a really, really accurate. That's a really accurate depiction of what I do. I'm like you were saying earlier about the magpie, picking out all the little bits and then saying, oh, let's combine this bit with this bit, but not saying, there was a world where everybody lived in the clouds. Yeah. That's a whole different kind of mind that is not my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. But if they live in the clouds, what do they do with their feet?
Exactly. That's what I want to know. And in fact, it might be, I hope I'm not over attributing to Neil Gaiman, but I think it was him in something he had written where he was saying, you come up with this world, but then you have to think of the details, like where do people go to the bathroom?
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, where do they go to the bathroom?
Yes. I would have a hard time with that because I am skeptical too. So it would be hard for me, I think, to turn off some of that skepticism, to just kind of go with it long enough to build a big enough structure to then start going. Yeah, I don't think that would be my strength at all. That would be fascinating to work with someone like that, though.
Yes, it would be. Yeah, and I think kind of similar to what I think you're implying, that I would get stuck on a thing about
reality,
explaining the mechanics. And thinking through how that works. Like I loved The Martian, Andy Weir's The Martian, because he had clearly thought through everything having to do with what if you have to grow potatoes on Mars to stay alive. And I found it fascinating, and in a way more fascinating than the more fantastical elements of like imagining being on Mars and stuff like that. I don't know. It's very interesting. I really like your take on that.
Okay, let's switch. Let's get back to your books. And what misconceptions do you think people have about your genres, especially things they think they know about them, and it's not necessarily so?
Well, specific to my books, this is very interesting because if I can enlist your listeners for some market research, I would encourage them to let me know what they think about this. But as I described, so the Lizzy Ballard books are just thrillers in the sense that the question is the protagonist going to survive?
Mm-hmm.
The Ann Kinnear book started out as suspense, as I described. In The Sense of Death, the reader sees right away that a murder has taken place. And the suspenseful question is Ann Kinnear going to survive that encounter? And then the second book was still had that suspense spin to it, but there was a mystery. Like there was a reveal at the end. Mm. So it was more like a mystery than the first one had been. And then books 3 through 5 and 6, when it comes out, are all going to be true, like whodunit mysteries. And I've really been on the fence about how to handle that, because in my ideal world, someone reads book 1, they love it and they read straight through, but then their experience is going to change slightly. And I think that for me, it wouldn't be a problem because I don't read books specifically because I want to guess who done it. That's like a fun extra, but I'm not hanging my enjoyment or lack of enjoyment in the book on whether I get to make the guess. And so the difference between suspense and mystery for me as a reader is not a big deal, but I know there are people for whom that's why they're reading. And on the theory that I'd rather have a smaller number of the right readers reading my books than a larger number of people who might be disappointed, I try to be very clear with The Sense of Death that it is not a mystery. But I would love to point readers to books 3 through 6 if they're really looking for a mystery. And so that's not so much a misconception, I think, it's just a self-imposed confusion that I've created by, just the topics that pop into my head have lent themselves more to suspense or more to mystery. And I don't want to rebrand it as mystery because I might go back to the suspense in book 7. Can
readers come into the series at book 3 and hit the ground running?
Yeah, they're all standalone. And of course, as with any series, if you read them out of order, then you're getting certain spoilers about, I see that now she's living in Kennett Square. Yeah. But I don't think there are significant spoilers that would ruin people's experience. And I was talking with someone about just this dilemma that I described to you. And she said, it's like book 1 is the origin story. I was like, exactly. Because the other big difference is that in the first book, Anne's this ability she has to sense spirits, is quite basic. Like she can't communicate with them until the very end of the book. And then with each book, her ability becomes more and more extensive. And so in book 2, she's actually communicating with dead people. So I would love to reposition it as it's the Ann Kinnear mysteries with a suspenseful origin story. But
I like that, and I think that would make sense to a lot of readers.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of what would the mechanism be for doing that in a way that was understandable to people.
I have a very distinct view of mystery, suspense, and thriller. I have not gotten the rest of the world on board with me yet. I think.
What is it?
Mysteries are whodunits. Is the protagonist going to figure out who committed the murder? And it better be a murder. I don't like these where there was no murder. That's cheap. There has to have been a murder. I don't need multiple bodies, but there has to have been a murder. To me, suspense is, will the main character survive?
Yep.
Whatever's going on. Thriller is, will the world survive?
Interesting.
Or this big something or other element. And I love whodunits, and I want the twisty, but I want the twisty, I want the whodunit, but I read for the characters.
Yes.
So I would like your origin story. And I think you've actually just really helped me with something, because I have these 2 mystery series, the Caught Dead in Wyoming series and the Secret Sleuth series. And I started writing a story in which the protagonists meet before either series starts. And I have said in the series that they hadn't investigated murders before. So I'm stuck that this pre-story can't have a murder. And I was trying to figure out how I was going to position it. It's an origin story. Yay. Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you, Matty. And thank you, whoever told Matty.
Yeah.
That is terrific. Boy, we got way off. What else? Which is part of the fun. And I tell the readers all the time and the listeners that this is like listening into a couple of authors talking like we would at the bar.
Exactly. We should have shown up with drinks.
We should have. And gosh, all I'm drinking is sparkling plain water. That's really, really boring. Okay. What for you is the hardest part of the story, of writing the story?
Well, after having had the experience with the Most Words Thrown Away and Kinnear Book 5, I feel like it has, so actually I do know the answer to this question. So the answer to the question, and I think this is true probably for any suspense thriller or mystery writer, is the dreaded, you know what would be cooler moment. Because almost all the scenes I had to throw out were because I had 50,000 words in, and I'd be like, but you know what would be cooler? And once you think of the cooler idea, you can't not do it, right? Like you have to do the cooler idea, but it costs you. It costs you in time. It costs you in words. If you decide it would be cooler that somebody else is the victim, then there's going to be a lot of ripping and tearing.
Do you find that the stories get more and more complex as I will start one and I'll think, oh, this one is going to be just really straightforward. And and then I think, oh, but
well, yeah, my stories are pretty complicated, and I have started being a project manager. I actually have spreadsheets. When I get to a certain point, I do this frame that I was describing, which is describing the story without the dialogue or the, colorful color commentary. And I have a spreadsheet that is all the characters across one axis and all the chapters along the other axis. And then in each cell, I put what the character knew, thought, and did in that chapter, because it has saved me from like acting as if two characters don't know each other when they already met 7 chapters ago. Or once you've done this, and I don't do it through the whole thing, I only do it until it's not useful to me anymore, and then I put it away. But you can say, okay, in chapter 7, like what's going on with everybody? Because I've sort of lost track of what's happening on this other subplot. Or you can look down the row and say, I want to see if the journey that this character goes on is sensible. Like, unless there's a reason for it, they can't believe thing A and then believe thing B and believe thing A and then believe thing B. They can do that, but you better explain. Like, it better be part of the story. It can't just be coincidental that suddenly they believe B. But
that's where I get myself in trouble, Matty, because I do a lot of it in my head. I don't plot. I have no charts or anything. And I used to be able to hold it in my head better. But what happens is I'll have character thinks A, and then they think B, and then they go back to A. Of course, this is not necessarily chronological. And then I'll think, oh, but the reason I could be sane and go back and get rid of that second A. But no, I come up with some other reason that they went back to A, and that ends up cascading through the whole story and complicating everything. And I always think, okay, this time I'm going to come back and be sane and keep it simpler. And I never do.
I think your readers, and I'm going to hark back to, again, the conversation you had with Joanna Penn, where you were talking about some of these things. And I think the consistent message was that you weren't recommending that people follow your way.
Oh, no.
The two of you were just talking about all the different ways people can go about it. And I think that in the final analysis, the readers will tell you, whether they liked whatever path that explaining why B happened occurred, or if they didn't.
And the reason for me to say how I write is because there are some other people out there who write the way I do, and nobody recommends it. Nobody recommends it. I don't even recommend it. But I will say you can survive and thrive writing that way. If that's the way your creativity comes, don't give up.
I think that you have to not fight against what your natural tendency is. You have to find ways of managing it as efficiently as possible.
So we have wandered, and we still have to do the either ors, which I absolutely prefer. But before we get to that, is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to answer? Or if I'm going to be really wicked, is there anything I haven't answered that you don't want to answer?
I don't know. I can't think we have had a very wide-ranging conversation. Yes. I can't think of anything that specifically pops out, except just to offer the casting out the question to your listeners again about how do they feel about a series that switches between
that would be
Suspense. I would love to hear what people think about that, and they can find me at mattydalrymple.com to drop me a note about that.
And you will share that with us, right?
I would love to share that with you.
That would be fascinating to hear. Okay, so these are rapid fire either ors to let the readers know about you. And I have been dying to ask one of these since the beginning of our conversation. So I will start with sailboat or motorboat?
Motorboat.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Why? Oh, I shouldn't do that. No.
Okay.
Stop asking questions, Patricia. Okay. Daisies or roses?
Daisies.
Appetizer or dessert?
Appetizer.
Mountains or beach?
Mountains.
Really? That's surprising. Okay.
If you said like waterfront, I'd say waterfront, but beach suggests to me like sitting on a towel.
Okay. Okay. Day or night?
Day.
Paper plates or best china?
Paper plates.
House decorating or gardening?
House decorating.
Fall or spring?
Ooh, I've got to say spring.
Cake or ice cream?
Ice cream.
Cat or dog?
Dog.
Tea or coffee?
Tea.
Winter Olympics or Summer Olympics?
Oh boy. Summer Olympics, I think I'll say.
Yeah, see, I don't allow anybody to say they don't like the Olympics. So that's sort of built into the question. Mustard or ketchup?
Mustard. Because, my mustard colored clothing.
Oh.
But you have the ketchup colored clothing. So I think we have both of them covered.
We got the condiments covered here. Pickup or sports car?
Sports car.
Opera or show tunes?
Show tunes.
Jigsaw puzzle or crossword puzzle?
Oh God. Can I say neither for any of these?
Yes. Okay.
I'll say jigsaw. If I have to pick, I'll say jigsaw because I'm woefully bad at crossword.
Grab the best first or save the best for last?
Save the best for last.
Okay. Thank you so much for going along with that.
And that was so fun.
Spending all this time with us. I really appreciate it, Matty.
Oh, it's been super fun. Thank you for the invitation.
And to the listeners, we will be back with another edition of Authors Love Readers sometime. Schedules are not my strong point, as my listeners probably know, but it's been terrific getting to know you better for me as well as for the listeners.
Yeah, this has been a great experience. I've loved chatting with you.
And I wish everybody out there, as well as Matty, happy listening and reading until we talk again. That's the show for this time. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for joining Authors Love Readers podcast. Remember, you can always find out more about our guest authors in the show notes, and you can find out more about me at www.patriciamclinn.com. You can also send in questions to be asked of future guests at podcasts@authorslovereaders.com. Until next time, wishing you lots of happy reading and listening.